Somewhere in the soil of western Montana, beneath a rock shelter on a quiet hillside, the bones of a small boy lay undisturbed for more than 12,000 years. He was barely 2 years old when he died. His body had been stained with red ochre and buried with more than 100 carefully made stone tools. Across 2 continents, in soils from Alaska to Patagonia, spear points share his signature. The textbooks will tell you these were the first Americans. A culture of mammoth hunters who crossed Beringia, swept south through an empty continent, and then vanished around 10,800 BCE, leaving only their fluted points behind. For nearly 80 years, that was the story. Then in 2014, geneticists sequenced the DNA from that small Montana skeleton. And when the results came back, almost every part of the textbook story collapsed. The Clovis were never who we were told they were. And more unsettling than that, they never actually vanished. To understand what the DNA overturned, you have to first understand what the DNA was overturning. And that means going back to a story that for most of the 20th century was treated as settled, complete, and beyond serious revision. The story had a name. It was called Clovis First, and it shaped almost everything we believed about how the Americas came to be populated. It began with a discovery. In 1936, near the small town of Clovis, New Mexico, archaeologists working a dry arroyo turned up a set of stone spear points that did not look like anything they had seen before. Long, leaf-shaped, fluted down both faces with a single channel running from the base toward the tip, designed to fit snugly into a wooden shaft. The workmanship was extraordinary. The points were thin, symmetrical, and lethally sharp, and they were lying beside the bones of mammoths. Within a few years, identical points began turning up across the continent. From the high plains of Wyoming to the river valleys of Pennsylvania, from the deserts of Arizona to the wetlands of Florida. Eventually, more than 1,500 sites would be identified across what is now the United States, southern Canada, and northern Mexico, with possible reach as far as the northern coasts of South America. Over 10,000 individual artifacts would be cataloged. The points were so consistent in shape and technique that they had to represent a single, coherent culture. Or so it appeared. A picture began to assemble itself. Skilled nomadic hunters, moving in small bands, crossing the Beringian land bridge from far eastern Siberia roughly 13,000 years ago. Descending south through an ice-free corridor between the retreating glaciers, spreading across an empty continent in a matter of centuries. Specialists in megafauna, killers of mammoths, mastodons, and ancient bison, a people defined by their tools, which were knapped from flint, chert, obsidian, jasper, and on occasion carved directly from the bones of the animals they had hunted. This was the founding population, the textbooks said, the first Americans, the original pioneers. Every indigenous culture from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Mapuche of Patagonia descended from them in a clean, unbroken line. The dates lined up, the artifacts lined up, the geography lined up. Clovis First became the dominant framework for nearly 80 years, repeated in museum displays, taught in university lecture halls, printed in encyclopedias, and consulted by every researcher who wanted to publish on early American prehistory without risking professional credibility. The model had a tidy shape. A continent was empty. A people arrived. A people spread. A people vanished around 10,800 BCE when their distinctive points disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced by the fulsome culture and then by the hundreds of regional traditions that would follow. The vanishing was treated as one of the great unresolved puzzles of American prehistory. Where had they gone? What had happened to them? The textbooks acknowledged the question and moved on. There were dissenting voices. There always had been. A handful of archaeologists working at sites in South America, in the Pacific Northwest, in the Texas Hill Country, kept producing dates that did not fit. Layers of human occupation that appeared to predate the Clovis horizon by hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Their work was dismissed. The dates were called contaminated. The sites were called misinterpreted. The careers of researchers who pressed the issue stalled. Clovis First was not merely a theory. It was an institution, and institutions defend themselves. But here's the thing about the standard narrative. It was built almost entirely from stone, from points and blades and the bones of butchered animals, from the residue of campsites and the geometry of spear shafts. The bones of the Clovis people themselves, the men and women and children who had held those points and used them, were missing from the record. In nearly a century of excavation across 2 continents, only one confirmed Clovis burial had ever been found. And for decades, the bones in that burial sat largely unread, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. The story of who the Clovis were, where they came from, and what happened to them was constructed without the most important evidence. It was a story written in the absence of the people themselves. And when the technology finally arrived in the form of ancient DNA, pulled from a single small skeleton in Montana, it did not gently revise the textbook version. It overthrown it. And the overturning would happen in 2 directions at once. The single confirmed Clovis burial sits on a hillside in western Montana, on what was once a working ranch outside the small town of Wilsall. The site is unremarkable to look at. A sandstone outcrop, a south-facing slope, a stand of cottonwoods near a creek. There is nothing about the place that announces what lay beneath it for more than 12,000 years. In May of 1968, a construction worker named Ben Hargis was clearing rock from beneath the outcrop with a front-end loader. He was widening an access road for the ranch. The blade caught on something. When he stopped to look, he found stone tools scattered in the disturbed earth, long, finely worked spear points, antler shafts, a scatter of small bones. The bones, when examined later, belonged to a child. He was barely 2 years old when he died. The skeletal evidence places his age between 12 and 18 months. His bones had been carefully arranged beneath the rock shelter and covered with red ochre, a powdered iron oxide pigment used by Indigenous peoples across the Americas for ritual and ceremonial purposes for tens of thousands of years. Around him lay more than 100 stone artifacts, also coated in ochre, fluted spear points, bifaces, tools made from antler and bone. The objects were not casual. They were grave goods. Someone had buried this child with intention, with grief, and with what appears to have been religious care. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial at roughly 12,600 years old. It was, and remains today, the only confirmed Clovis burial ever discovered. A singular window into a people known almost entirely through the weapons they left behind. The child was given a name drawn from the family who owned the ranch. Anzick I. For decades, the bones sat largely unstudied. They were stored, examined briefly, and then mostly left alone. The technology to read them in any meaningful way did not yet exist. Archaeologists could measure them, photograph them, estimate the child's age and physical condition, but they could not answer the question that mattered most. Who was he, biologically? Where had his ancestors come from? How was he related to the populations still living across the Americas today? Then in the early 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that made the impossible possible. A team of geneticists led by Eska Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen, working in close consultation with members of the Crow, Blackfeet, and other indigenous communities of the region, received permission to extract and sequence DNA from the bones of Anzick I. The consultation was not a formality. The team understood in a way that most 20th century researchers had not, that the bones belonged to someone's ancestor. The descendants had to be partners in the work, not subjects of it. The extraction was technically demanding. 12,000 years in the ground degrades genetic material almost beyond recovery. but the cold, dry conditions of the Montana hillside had preserved enough DNA for sequencing. The lab work took years. The result, when it was ready, would settle a question that had defined American archaeology for nearly a century. If Anzick I was a Clovis individual and the textbooks were right that the Clovis were the founding population of all Indigenous Americans, then his DNA should look like a foundational ancestor. He should be biologically positioned at the root of nearly every present-day indigenous lineage in the Americas. The Caritiana of Brazil, the Maya of Yucatan, the peoples of the Canadian subarctic. He should be, in genetic terms, the great-great-grandfather of two continents. If the textbooks were wrong, the DNA would say so. The sequence was published in the journal Nature in February 2014. And it did something more interesting than either possibility allowed for. It confirmed part of the story, it demolished another part, and it raised a question that the standard model had not even thought to ask. The result would force a rewrite of the textbook narrative in two directions at the same time. The first overturning concerned who the Clevos actually were. It revealed that they were not the first to arrive on the continent at all, that the population they descended from had been here for thousands of years before the first fluted point was ever made. The second overturning concerned what had happened to them. It revealed that the people called Clevos had never disappeared, that their direct biological descendants were living across two continents in numbers that ran into the tens of millions. Both findings were sitting inside the DNA of a single small boy buried with ochre on a Montana hillside. The first overturning was about the past, about what had come before Clevos, and it began with a pattern hidden in the structure of Anzick I's genome. The DNA confirmed, as expected, that the child's ancestry traced back to Asia. The genetic signal pointed across the Bering Strait and into Siberia, exactly where the textbook story had placed the origin of all early Americans. That part of the model held. But the genome contained something else, something the standard narrative could not account for. Anzick I's ancestry was not a single undivided lineage. It was structured. His DNA showed that the population from which he descended had already split into two distinct branches before he was born. One branch ancestral to most indigenous peoples of Central and South America. Another branch ancestral to many northern populations across North America. A split of that depth does not happen overnight. Geneticists can estimate, with reasonable precision, how long it takes for two populations to diverge to the degree visible in Anzick I's genome. The numbers pointed to a separation that had occurred long before the Clevos culture itself appeared in the archaeological record. The founding population had been in the Americas for thousands of years before anyone made a fluted point. This finding did not arrive in a vacuum. For decades, dissenting archaeologists had been producing dates from sites across the Americas that did not fit the Clovis First model. Their work had been dismissed, their careers stalled, their evidence called contaminated or misinterpreted. The DNA from Anzick I vindicated them. Consider Monte Verde, a site in southern Chile excavated by Tom Dillahay beginning in the late 1970s. The layers contained the remains of wooden tent stakes, knotted cordage, plant residues, even preserved footprints. The radiocarbon dates returned a result of more than 14,500 years ago. For more than 1,000 years before any Clovis point existed anywhere on Earth, human beings were living in southern Chile, building shelters, cooking meals, and tying knots. The site was rejected for decades. By the late 1990s, the evidence had become impossible to dismiss. Other sites followed. The Galt site in central Texas, with stone tools buried in layers beneath the Clovis horizon. Paisley Caves in eastern Oregon, where human coprolites, preserved by the dry desert climate, returned radiocarbon dates of more than 14,300 years. Cooper's Ferry in western Idaho, a stratified site with stone tools and butchered animal bones dated to at least 16,000 years old. And then, most stunning of all, the footprints at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, fossilized impressions of adults and children walking along an ancient lake shore, now dated to over 21,000 years before the present. 21,000 years, nearly twice the age of the oldest Clovis point ever found. The picture that emerged from the combined evidence was not subtle. Human beings had been living in the Americas for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands of years, before the first Clovis spear point was napped from a piece of flint. The Clovis were not pioneers crossing into an empty continent. They were a cultural phenomenon, a technology, a hunting tradition, a way of organizing labor around the pursuit of megafauna. And that phenomenon had emerged from populations that had already been here for a very long time. The textbooks had described the Clovis as the founders. The DNA described them as descendants. The implications ran in every direction. The peopling of the Americas was no longer a single event with a single date. It was a process that stretched back into deep time, involving multiple migrations, multiple coastal and inland routes, and populations that had moved, settled, separated, and diverged across the continent for millennia before any of them ever held a fluted point. The beringian standstill, the rise of distinct ancestral branches, the slow seeding of two continents with human life. All of it had been happening long before Clovis. The culture that bore the name Clovis turned out to be something more specific and more interesting than the textbook version. It was a specialized hunting tradition that emerged within an already populated landscape, spread with remarkable speed across that landscape over a few centuries, and produced the distinctive fluted points that would later be mistaken for the signature of the first arrivals. The first overturning, then, was a question of time. The Clovis were not the beginning. They were a chapter in a story that had begun thousands of years before they were born and would continue thousands of years after their stone points stopped being made. But the second overturning was stranger, and it concerned not the past, but what had supposedly happened to them at the end. The second overturning was about what came after, about the moment around 10,800 BCE when the fluted points stopped appearing in the archaeological record, when the Clovis culture, by the conventional reading, disappeared. The textbooks had treated this as one of the great mysteries of American prehistory. A people had risen, a people had vanished. The points were gone, the hunters were gone. Where had they all gone? The DNA answered the question, and the answer was that no one had gone anywhere. When researchers compared the genome of Anzick 1 to modern populations across the Americas, the result was startling in its clarity. His DNA was a near-perfect ancestral match for approximately 80% of all present-day indigenous peoples across North, Central, and South America. From the Caritiana of the Brazilian Amazon to the Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula to communities in the Canadian subarctic and the high deserts of the American Southwest. The biological continuity ran from a single small boy buried on a Montana hillside 12,600 years ago, directly into the bodies of tens of millions of people alive today. This was the crucial finding. Because the standard narrative had treated the disappearance as a population event, as the kind of vanishing that required an explanation, disease, famine, conquest, some catastrophic collapse that had emptied a continent of its first inhabitants. None of those things had happened. The people had not died. The people had not left. The people had remained exactly where they were, on the land their ancestors had crossed, raising children, telling stories, adapting to the world as it changed around them. What had disappeared was a tool. The fluted spear point, the technology that had given the Clovis culture its name, stopped being made because the animals it had been designed to kill were vanishing. A spear point engineered to penetrate the hide of a 5-ton mammoth is a poor instrument for hunting deer. As the megafauna of the late Pleistocene died out across North America in a window of a few centuries, the toolkit that had been built around them lost its purpose. Smaller, lighter, more varied projectile points began to replace the fluted ones. The Folsom culture emerged with points designed for hunting the slightly smaller ancient bison. After Folsom came Plano, Dalton, and dozens of regional traditions that would multiply across the continent in the millennia that followed. The people did not vanish. The technology evolved. The culture branched. The descendants of the men and women who had once hunted mammoths with fluted points became the ancestors of the Mississippi mound builders, the Anasazi of the Southwest, the Iroquois of the eastern woodlands, the Inca of the Andes, the Lakota of the plains, the Inuit of the Arctic, and every other indigenous culture across 2 continents. The textbooks had described a disappearance. The DNA described a continuity unbroken for more than 500 generations. This is the part of the story that has to be told carefully. Because the descendant communities, the indigenous peoples of the Americas whose ancestors made and carried those fluted points, have been saying this for centuries. Their oral traditions had preserved the knowledge. Their origin stories had described unbroken presence on the land. Their elders had taught their children that they had always been here, that the ancestors had not gone away, that the continuity from the deep past to the present was a lived inheritance rather than an archaeological abstraction. The academic world, by and large, had refused to treat those traditions as evidence. For nearly a century, the dominant model had described the Clovis as a vanished people, their fate a puzzle, their descendants uncertain. The descendants themselves had been telling the Academy who they were the entire time. The traditions had been accurate. The textbooks had been wrong. What ancient DNA confirmed in 2014 was something that had never actually been forgotten. It had only been ignored. The vanishing was a vanishing of stone tools in the archaeological record, nothing more. The people who had carried those tools, the families who buried a small child with ochre on a Montana hillside, the lineages that ran from that burial forward through 12,000 years of continuous occupation had been here all along. Living in the same valleys, walking the same rivers, telling versions of the same origin stories. The textbooks had asked where the Clovis had gone. The DNA and the descendants who had been speaking the whole time returned the same answer: nowhere. They had not gone anywhere. They were still here. If the Clovis were descendants, the question shifts. Descendants of whom? And how did the founding population, the one that had already split into branches before Anzick I was born, arrive on the continent in the first place? The answer is more complicated and considerably stranger than the textbook version ever allowed. The current best reconstruction is called the beringian standstill. The model proposes that the ancestors of all indigenous Americans separated from East Asian populations roughly 25,000 years ago, somewhere along the eastern edge of Siberia. They moved onto the Bering Land Bridge, the vast plain that connected Asia to Alaska during the last ice age when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. And there, on a tundra steppe larger than modern Alaska itself, they remained. Not for a generation, not for a century, for as long as 8,000 to 10,000 years. This is the standstill. A population in genetic isolation, cut off from Asia by ice to the west and from the Americas by ice to the east, occupying a stretch of habitable land between 2 glacial barriers, long enough for the lineage to develop the distinctive genetic signatures that mark all indigenous American populations to this day, long enough for accumulated mutations to set the founders apart from the East Asian populations they had left behind. The Americas were not peopled in a sudden crossing. They were peopled by a population that had spent 10,000 years preparing for the journey south. When the ice finally retreated enough to permit movement, that population began to disperse. And the dispersal did not happen along a single route. Multiple waves, multiple paths. An ice-free corridor opened between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets in the interior of the continent, threading down from Alaska through what is now Alberta. A separate coastal route ran along the Pacific shoreline, hugging the edge of the continent through landscapes now submerged beneath rising post-glacial seas. People moved through both. The genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests the coastal route was used first, with populations reaching as far south as Chile, while the interior corridor was still locked under ice. The picture grows stranger still. In 2015, geneticists studying indigenous populations in the Amazon basin detected a faint, unexpected signal. Certain communities, particularly the Surui and Caritiana of Brazil, showed traces of ancestry connected not to East Asian populations, but to ancient peoples of Oceania and Australasia. The signal was small, it was contested, it remains debated today, but it raised a possibility that the founding population was not entirely uniform, that the peopling of the Americas may have involved earlier dispersals, leaving genetic ghosts in certain South American groups. Researchers labeled the unknown source Population Y. Whoever they were, they reached the continent before the standstill descendants did. Their full story has yet to be told. What all of this means is that the Clovis culture, the centerpiece of the 20th century textbook narrative, was a relatively brief and technologically distinctive flowering inside a much longer human story. The Clovis horizon itself lasted somewhere between 300 and 500 years. A few centuries of fluted points and mammoth hunts, set within a human presence in the Americas that had already been unfolding for thousands of years before it began and would continue for thousands of years after it ended. The comparison is worth pausing on. The Clovis culture endured for roughly the same length of time as the period stretching from Christopher Columbus to the present day. A short, brilliant moment of cultural and technological coherence inside a far older human inheritance. The fluted point was not the beginning of human life in the Americas. It was a paragraph in a chapter that had been opened long before by populations whose names we may never recover, whose tools we have only begun to find, and whose descendants are still walking the continent today. The textbooks had treated the Clovis as the founders. The DNA reveals them as something more interesting than founders. They were inheritors. They were one population among several, in a story that had already been running for thousands of years when their distinctive technology emerged. The standstill ancestors, the coastal migrants, the interior corridor travelers, the contested population Y signal, and the Clovis hunters themselves all sit within a single, unfinished narrative whose full shape is still being reconstructed. The textbooks had described a beginning. The DNA describes a chapter, and the chapters before it, and the chapters after, belong to the same continuous human story that began somewhere in eastern Siberia 25,000 years ago and has not stopped since. After the genome of anzick 1 was sequenced, after the result had been published in Nature, after the two overturnings of the textbook narrative had been documented in the scientific literature, there remained one question that the laboratory could not answer. What was to be done with the bones? The boy had lain in the Montana hillside for more than 12,000 years. He had been removed from the earth in 1968, examined intermittently for decades, and finally, in the early 2010s, his genetic material had been extracted and read. The information he carried had answered a question that had defined American archaeology for nearly a century. But he was still, in the end, a small child who had been buried by his family with ochre and care. He was someone's ancestor, and the question of what should happen to him next was not a question for geneticists alone. The research team had made a decision early in the project that distinguished it from a century of prior practice. They had approached the indigenous communities of the region before the DNA work began. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Shoshone, the other tribal nations whose territories overlapped the Montana hillside where the burial had been found. The team had asked for permission. They had explained what the analysis would involve. They had committed to sharing the findings with the descendant communities before publication, and they had agreed that whatever came of the work, the bones themselves would not remain in a laboratory drawer when it was over. In June 2014, 4 months after the genome was published, the remains of anzick 1 were returned to the earth. The reburial took place near the original site, on the same hillside above the same creek where the boy had been laid down 12,600 years earlier. Representatives from local tribal nations led the ceremony. Songs were sung in languages descended, biologically and culturally, from his own. The bones were covered, the ground was closed, the boy was returned to where his family had placed him. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to tell. Because for more than a century before this moment, the bones of Indigenous ancestors had been treated by the academic world as specimens. They had been removed from burial sites without consent. They had been cataloged, measured, photographed, and stored in the basements of museums and universities across North America. Tens of thousands of ancestral remains taken from the descendants who had buried them, held in institutional collections for generations of researchers to study without permission and often without acknowledgement of what those remains actually were. The history of American archaeology, until very recently, was a history conducted largely without the participation of the people whose ancestors it was studying. The Anzick I collaboration was a deliberate counterexample. It was an attempt to do the work differently, to treat the descendants as descendants, to allow oral tradition and scientific evidence to inform each other rather than to compete for authority, to recognize that the bones of an Indigenous child are not a resource to be mined for academic publications. They are a relative. They belong to a lineage, and the lineage has a voice. What the descendant communities had been saying for centuries, the DNA confirmed. The boy was their relative. The people who had buried him with ochre and stone tools and offerings were their ancestors. The continuity from that burial forward into the present was not a hypothesis to be tested. It was a lived inheritance that the academic world was finally prepared to acknowledge. The framing matters. For nearly a century, the dominant narrative had described the Clovis as a vanished people, their fate uncertain, their descendants unidentified. The descendants themselves had been speaking the entire time. They had said in their oral traditions and their origin stories and the testimony of their elders that they had always been here, that the ancestors had not gone away, that the continuity ran unbroken from the deep past into the bodies of the living. The evidence supports exactly that framing. The traditions were accurate, the continuity was real. The disappearance was a story told by people who arrived later and decided the narrative needed an ending. What ancient DNA did at Anzick was not rediscover the Clovis. It confirmed what had never actually been forgotten. The boy went back into the earth. The information he carried entered the scientific record, and the descendants who had been waiting 12,000 years for the rest of us to listen received, for once, the courtesy of being treated as the authorities on their own ancestors. A people were called the first Americans, while their own ancestors had already been here for thousands of years. A culture was called vanished, while its descendants farmed the same valleys, walked the same plains, and carried in their bodies the exact biological record of the ones who had carved those fluted points. The oral traditions told the story accurately for 12,000 years. The archaeologists simply refused to listen. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Clovis. It confirmed what had never actually been forgotten, except by the people who came later and decided the story needed an ending. The real mystery of the first Americans is not who they were, or where they came from, or what happened to them. It is how long it took the rest of us to understand that the answer had been here the whole time, in the soil, in the spear points, and in the living descendants who were never lost at all.